Good afternoon. We are the last session before the coffee break, so I appreciate you sticking with us mid-afternoon. But I'm very excited to look at the discussion and the theme that was just explored in the prior panel through a slightly different angle with Natalie Blythe, who's the Global Head of Commercial Banking Sustainability at HSBC. Because as we just heard, there are so many different actors that need to work together when you're thinking about these very long and complex supply chains, and banks certainly play a key role in this. So I was hoping to begin by asking you, obviously as companies have set net zero targets and now they start thinking about how to meet them, looking through their supply chains is of utmost importance. And I'm wondering, as a bank, what you see from those suppliers. What is the response that you see from some of the suppliers further down in the chain as they try to comply with the targets the companies have set for them?
I guess we're probably seeing everything. So if you look at the types of clients that we've got the large, the middle, and the small. But actually, the archetypes of clients that we've got in relation to sustainability are quite different. They fall into three categories, which doesn't necessarily align with size. So you've got those that are really sophisticated, leaning into supply chains, like a Walmart, for example. And we've done quite a lot of actions with them about getting down into the tiers, whether it's carbon, whether it's societal, and diversity and improvement into getting finance in the supply chain. You've got this middle group of sort of clients that they want to know that the bank's going to be with them. So to Patricia's point earlier this morning, it's about mitigation, adaptation, and financing. These clients are really keen to know that the financing is going to be there, the support is going to be there. They want to know what it is that we need in terms of data to satisfy our own requirements and how it is that we can help them. Then there's a third group, which really are exposed to policy and supply chain shocks because they have no data, they have no resource. We were talking about skill sets and very little know-how either. So what we're seeing is some extraordinary things, people completely reconfiguring their business models. But they don't necessarily need to be in the big sophisticated group. They can actually be an SME. There's a great case in, actually it's a client, a waste management client that's reconfigured their model because there's some policy around landfill cost. So that's made their business model, a bit shaky going forward. They have actually introduced and put some CapEx in, buying this incredible funky machine, to be honest with you, I can't remember its name, that recycles construction waste. So now they have a business model that's a win-win-win. So no landfill costs, they've got new revenue stream, and they've got much reduced greenhouse gases. So if you can get that sweet spot, and their supply chain is reconfigured as a result of it, that's when it really sort of works, the win-win-win. But we're also getting clients who wake up in the morning to find that because they haven't got a carbon calculator, because they don't know what their E, S, and G footprint is, they no longer qualify for their buyers' criteria in their supply chain. So everything we're seeing.
So let's stick with that last group that you just outlined, because that's the one, obviously, that has the biggest hurdle to cross over. How do you go from that level of readiness, i.e. not ready at all, to being able to comply? How long is that process, and what are the steps that are involved?
So I think, again, it really depends, and I was interested in the comments about the short supply chains are the easier ones to fix. There are fewer players involved, and we can sort of really make a difference there. The long, complex, really sort of wicked systems, if we want to go that far, are the harder ones to fix. But as a bank, you do three things, not just HSBC, any bank. You finance, everybody's familiar with that, but you facilitate as well, and you absorb and mitigate risk. I think there's a real role for the facilitation and the advisory here. How can we partner with other people to provide them with carbon calculators? We had EcoVadis on earlier. How can we sort of partner to provide them with ESG sort of scoring so that they can track and show the improvement? How can we share knowledge? How can the buyers lean in and sort of share their knowledge and their financing capacity? That's what supply chain finance at the end of the day often does, is it leverages a bigger corporate sort of financing ability and pushes it down to where it's needed most. And the bank's job in the whole of this great transition is to pivot capital to where it needs to be in the future. Now, there's no right or wrong answer to where it needs to be, but it's different from where it is today.
May I ask you, you mentioned the carbon calculator as well as an ESG scoring. What are the other tools in that toolbox? Is there anything else that you deploy or you advise companies on that are necessary?
So I would say those are the two real game changers, because if you can't show, and I know we had, I can't remember, was it Tom earlier, who was sort of saying all the numbers are wrong and you can't really the accuracy is not there. But what we need to see is directional change. And we need to be comfortable with goals moving over time and recognizing that the quality of the data is going to improve, but harnessing that big data and actually getting proxy scores for some of the sort of smaller segments, I think is a legitimate way forward. So not just a carbon calculator or ESG scoring, but if we harness big data, we should be able to provide a client, a real SME, with a sort of a proxy score. And that's good enough for today, because it's all we're going to get today. And we need to be moving today in the direction of transformation and pivot.
May I ask you, so you use the example of one small company where they were able to basically effectuate a win-win-win. I imagine that there are other companies for which it's a win-win-lose or a win-lose-lose. So how do you help to galvanize change among the companies for which the financial payoff is not entirely clear, or there's a puzzle that's actually much harder to fix?
I think you're right. It's where the sort of the payoff is not entirely clear. I'm a believer that we are going to be moving away from the capitalist and it's financial value creation alone that counts.
I'd like to just note for the record that we have a banker saying we're moving away from the capitalist model, but yes, continue.
I believe that we are going to move much more holistically into a more holistic understanding of value creation, and that is going to be how companies are judged and effectively valued, but it's going to be across multiple capitals, not just the financial capital. So it will include manufacturing capital, intellectual capital, human capital, again, education, societal capital, and of course, natural capital. And the question is, how do we start to experiment with sort of putting a value on these? How do we demonstrate that a corporate, whether it's a bank or not, is actually sort of a net positive contributor to the planet and society with profit?
So this is getting really interesting, because you're basically questioning sort of what a company's for, right? And how we convey value. So a simple way to sort of insert climate into a discussion of value is if there were a carbon tax, then we're pricing in the externalities. But you're talking about something much broader, right? So do you see there being support for that type of broad valuation in the way that companies are assessed? So I'm American. There's a huge backlash against ESG at the moment, which is the conventional way of doing this. So what's the sort of modern mechanism?
I'm not saying we should go as far as Patagonia have just done with their governance shift, which is their company now exists for the benefit of the planet. That's far out there. But they have led the way to this point in time, so B Corp is not a bad start.
Okay, I'll return. I could ask you about this for hours, but I'll rein myself in. So, in the work that you're doing with your customers, can you describe a bank's role, not just HSBC, but generally a bank's role in kind of being a broker between the different actors within the supply chain? Because you described the facilitating role that you can have directly with a customer. How do you then also work with the larger company to which that customer is supplying? How does the bank work in that sort of brokered role?
So if we put sustainability aside even at the moment and just look at what trade finance is, the bank sits in the middle of people who don't know each other and absorbs that sort of risk, clearly for a fee, but it is effective for those two partners to sort of trade with each other. It's facilitation. So in addition to that, there can be financing. So you're doing the facilitation, the risk mitigation, and the financing as well. If you put the sustainability layer on top, it's just the same. But what we've got is a sort of a bit of a pivot in terms of what are the objectives and the outcomes that we want to achieve. So the Walmart evolution is a good example of how we've evolved with that client relationship, specifically to address carbon in the first instance. That program then evolved to actually take into consideration inclusivity and gender and ethnicity. So specifically targeting suppliers and manufacturers into it who are run by women or run by black sort of minorities in the US. So it's a very powerful tool in terms of how you do it. That's from a buyer's side. Then what we saw was that the suppliers were getting engaged. Then what we saw was that we started to sort of move into collaborations with multilateral development banks. Again, so where the banks can't really go and get a bit queasy, because there is a 1.7 trillion, in fact, I think it's an all-time high, trade finance gap, hitting emerging markets, women, ethnic minorities the most. But if we collaborate with the multilaterals, we can actually start to get, again, capital to where it is needed, because there's a different risk profile that can be absorbed by a multilateral.
So tell me then, that question of capital mobilization is obviously at the heart of so much of today's discussion. So what additionally would be helpful, either in terms of private sector innovation, sort of other things that the private sector could do on its own, or public policy innovation to accelerate what you just described, where you're sort of working with the multilateral group and helping to get the finance to the entities in the supply chain who need it?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if Tom is still here, but he was one of the earlier speakers that I heard talking about, policy isn't going to be the sort of the answer because it's not going to happen. And I spoke to him afterwards and I said, well, how are banks going to go and finance these new technologies and get the infrastructure in there if they don't have a degree of certainty that the governments are going to support these technologies and flip out of EVs into hydrogen or something like that? So again, these are, who was talking about systems? These are wicked systems that we just need to jump into and start to sort of try and tackle them collectively. But we've got to get some certainty around that sort of risk profile to get the money to where it is needed.
So in this environment then where you don't necessarily have the policy certainty, how do you then manage that risk and an uncertainty as you design your own policies within the bank?
So your point is, let's get various private players together and start to sort of understand how we can slice and dice. We were talking about blockchain, or you were talking about blockchain earlier. It's potentially got a role in here to look at some of these infrastructure projects and actually take the segments of the different risks and then find the sort of the investors who are comfortable with those risks to take that chunk of it and divvy it up, rather than a bank sort of saying, woof, I'll take that one. I'll take a portion of that because I understand the technology risk. Or actually, I understand the technology risk, but I can't handle that it's 29 years, and yet a Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund can. So it is come together, slice and dice, and get the funding to where it's needed. Ideally quickly.
Okay, so fast and extremely complicated, right? So who's the convening actor in what you just described?
So, I mean, there are a whole bunch of multilateral, plurilateral sort of engagements, whether it's GFANs or whomever, who can start to sort of play a leading role here. We're a big bank. We are absolutely systemic, given our client base, given our scale, given our leading role in trade. We've got to have a seat at the table to get stuck in and drive this.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up and give time to questions from the audience. But one thing that you said that struck me at the very beginning of your comments is that really long supply chains are tricky. They're just hard. It's possible to make progress here, but the easier things to solve, the lower hanging fruit, is when you have a short supply chain. Do you think that this push towards sustainability will result in just a complete restructuring of supply chains to make them shorter? Are those days of long, wicked supply chains going to be over as it just becomes evident how much harder it is to meet targets with them in place?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There are so many factors coming into play that are disrupting supply chains. I don't think it's solely the sustainability agenda. When you look at geopolitics, energy insecurity, the whole shebang is pushing reimagining and reconfiguring supply chains, so for sure. So we've got friendshoring, onshoring, more regional. So yeah, they're going to change. That's one thing that is certain.
I'm curious to read about. You can read about this in a recent cover that I wrote in The Economist that was in June on rethinking globalization, which is all on this theme. Some of the different factors that are going to go into that. But may I take questions from the audience? Anyone? I have plenty more myself as well. No? Just one moment. Someone will come with you with a microphone, and if you could tell us who you are, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Harry Newport, and I work in the Infrastructure Projects Authority in the UK government. But my question was just to, so slightly unrelated, but just to expand on, you talked about the convening power, and obviously the banks being central, but who are the other parties? You talked about multilaterals and dividing the risk. I'm kind of quite curious to know a bit about the different parties and how you bring them together in a sort of operational way, I suppose.
I think you can do it on a sort of a portfolio level, or you can do it on a transaction level. But I think if we're looking at which technologies are going to be backed, then really there needs to be an understanding, I believe, with the sort of the national government to understand. So are you going to be backing EV? Are you going to be backing hydrogen? Or is it EV then hydrogen? What infrastructure needs to be put in place? Or are you going to let the sort of public environment work it out? And in which case, that's probably not optimal for an orderly transition.
I guess you're working in international markets as well, not just...
Absolutely international. That's where you have got potentially some beautiful sort of asset classes, and that you can slice and dice and share to different regions, different investors. Any investor will have a profile for this. And I anticipate actually that the distribution of some of these assets is going to be deeply attractive.
One more question. We have two over here, or three. I feel like an auction house bidder. First, the gentleman in the back, and then we'll come to these two. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My name is Musharraf Hussain. I'm founding director and consultant of Global Inclusion Consulting. Fantastic presentation from Nathalie. And I think sustainability is all about planet and people. And we are going to secure future generations. But at this moment, people are also vulnerable and suffering. If we see the event of a flood in Pakistan or drought in Madagascar. So business is working well to reduce carbon emission, but what you are doing for inclusion issue, or even to reach the marginalized people, disabled people are the most affected, and impact is huge. So I want to know about what is business is doing, or responsibility, or corporate responsibility for doing to address this issue.
Yeah. To your sort of earlier point, it's about people, planet. It is also about profit. This is about businesses thriving in the future. Arguably, sustainability means you just surviving. What we want are corporates that are really flourishing and thriving in the future. And to do that, again, I think it will be maybe in the long term, but we're going to start to look at value in a different way and value creation in a different way. What are we doing? The second part of your question, to address the sort of the more vulnerable who arguably don't even have access to financing. There are a bunch of technologies, and it does include blockchain, that can be used such that we can get financing to where it is needed. But again, partnerships with the multilateral development banks, pushing finance into supply chains.
Yes.
Sure, and I'm happy to be team tagged. So Nicole Rycroft with Canopy. And so we're an NGO, and we work deeply through supply chains towards transformation. And so part of it is taking the most high carbon, high biodiversity, socially egregious supply out of existing conventional supply chains. But it's also how do we speed and accelerate this transition to circular kind of game-changing technologies. And I think your comment about moving that money faster, because we work with 30 to 35 game-changing technology ventures. It often takes them 2, 3, 4 years to secure, especially on the pulp and paper and visco side. It's a $250, $300 million capex kind of intensive ticket. And so because these are new technologies, oftentimes conventional investors are, wary of that kind of first generation at scale kind of applications. And so I'm just wondering what kind of conversations you're having within HSBC, as well as kind of more broadly around how we kind of prevent each innovator that we need to have coming to scale on kind of like fast timelines, how we make them accessing not just venture capital, but more that kind of private equity for scale.
Yeah.
easier.
Let's go just to the, and then we'll take two questions at once. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I'm David Tyfield. I'm a Professor of Sustainable Transitions at Lancaster University. Very intrigued and excited by what you were saying. What I'm interested about, though, is how you mentioned infrastructure. Nice to hear that speaker as well. Obviously, a lot of infrastructure is actually highly place-based. It's very place-specific.
Yes. Yeah.
And that means that if you'll get, fantastic to have these round tables where people get up and they get round the table and divvy up the risk. But how do you do that for maybe more neglected places? I'm thinking, for instance, of many places in the north of England.
So you're right, infrastructure is national, but actually, if you're doing hydrogen, it's not necessarily exclusively national. So you could have hydrogen produced in the Middle East. I know transporting it's not great at the moment, but to actually serve a northern European economy. So let's get too carried away with it necessarily being purely national. But what we do need is some ideally steer, but if we're not going to get it, different collaboration to understand which technologies need to be backed where. And I think what we're seeing already is that different regions or countries are deciding on what they're going to be big on. So there are going to be some Far East and Middle East countries that are going to go quite big on ag tech, quite big on water, for obvious reasons. There are others that are going to be more disposed to sort of wind and so on, and EV and so on. So there is going to be a map. We're trying to map it right now, actually, which technologies are going to land where, because what we have to do as a bank is to determine how we allocate finite capital. And to a certain extent, we're trying to preempt who are the winners and losers, but equally, we're determining who are the winners and losers, because that's where the capital is going to be channeled. And it is a big pivot, and it's a pivot into new sectors and new technologies. It's a pivot geography-wise as well. So I think it's huge numbers of trillions that you will know, but not all geographies are equal as to who needs what to make the transitions. So geography pivot, sector pivot, within sector pivot, all of that needs to take place.
We unfortunately have to leave it there because that's such a thought-provoking idea. We all know that the new system of energy is going to have an entirely different geography, both physically and a geography of power, right? And so it's fascinating how that's playing out in real time. But for now, we're going to leave it there. There's a coffee break outside until 4:40 when we'll reconvene. But please thank Natalie Blythe.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.